Hello, Paul. I am Luca, the founder of the Living Care Company. It's lovely to have you onto our podcast.
Thanks for the invite.
Paul, tell us about yourself. What's your background, professionally speaking, and what do you do now?
Okay, so I'm a retired police officer. I spent 25 years, the bulk of which was as a detective sergeant for the bulk of the time. My experience spanned all through criminal investigation, general CID, up through as far as major crime, including homicide, rape, blackmail. And then the latter part of my career was spent in public protection, where I was the vulnerable adults investigations coordinator. So I became the sort of coordinator of any investigation which required a multi-agency approach. And for those investigations, I used specialist investigators, which I had a kind of a pool of that I could call upon depending on the area. The latter part of my career, I undertook a Master of Science degree in forensic accounting, and I'm now a specialist forensic accountant. I say specialist because I specialize in elder fraud, interfamilial, but any types of fraud involving a vulnerable person. So that kind of tends to come to me, unfortunately, after the event in the form of contentious probate. But I'm very happy to try and assist people that the subject is still alive, where we can help and assist them. I'm also an international subject matter expert in financial crime. So I've worked in the likes of Cayman Islands, Jordan, Eastern Europe, and I'm just about to start contracting Guernsey.
So you've gone from being in the police to being in the private sector, helping families with fraud and financial fraud. Give me a scenario where you might be able to help a family with the problems that they were having.
Probably the best example would be a fraudulent will, where the subject has been coerced into taking out a will. In fact, the last one I dealt with, the person was totally oblivious because the will was completely bogus. We undertook some inquiries to identify that the two witnesses to the will had actually signed a blank document. It was a will, but there was no signature of the maker. And the lady in question was particularly frail because she was suffering quite badly with dementia, and she wouldn't have been able to give testamentary capacity to actually sign the will anyway. That's the sort of example. Like I said, a lot of contentious probate, get involved with kind of family disputes where one sibling has been looking after mum, say, for a large part of the tail end of her life. And then the other siblings will come along and try and coerce mum into parting with money. I get involved in what I call the early inheritance syndrome. So whereby family members try and move funds sideways to avert the need to pay for care, which quite often is their downfall. And certainly as a police officer, when those sorts of matters got brought to my attention, that's kind of when we were able to take action, because a little bit of financial investigation could identify that there were transfers, big chunks of money that certainly weren't for the interests of the subject.
Yep. So you mentioned people being prey to the desire to change a will and things like that. But what proportion of fraud comes intrafamiliarly, i.e., from the person's own family? And what proportion of fraud comes from outside, like a email scam or a telephone scam or a wire?
Interesting question, because statistically, and not a lot of this interfamilial fraud gets reported because it takes place behind closed doors. It's between the family unit, and quite often it only gets uncovered when some other form of abuse is apparent. I dealt with a case with a gentleman in his late 50s who had considerable learning difficulties. He was carer for his mum, and mum was sort of carer for him. And mum sadly passed away, and he inherited from mum, as did his sister, but his sister then wanted his share. So she set upon trying to get that money from him. She and her partner went away on a holiday, a diving trip, and booked the brother into a respite care for the week. Of course, the carers stripped her down to wash him, to shower him on the first evening, and uncovered loads of bruising all over his body, in his sort of kidney area and his genitalia. And of course, that then kicked off the investigation. So we'd not only got physical abuse, but we got the financial abuse, which was uncovered as part of the investigation. And we'd uncovered the abuse of mum as well before she died, because the sister not only had money from her brother, but she'd had money from her a mother. So that's just how the scenarios roll out, really.
See, talking to clients, something that I know lots of people are anxious about and want to do whatever they can to avoid is to basically do what they can to protect a vulnerable individual, maybe someone with mild or moderate dementia might be at home who is still capable of answering the phone and being exposed to, a telephone call or an email or maybe someone coming to the door from outside and then effectively wanting to defraud the vulnerable person. What are the major things that you can do as a family member or friend to stop the vulnerable person that you love or who's your friend being
Yeah.
defrauded? What are the steps that someone should take?
There is some very good advice out there from actually Sussex. There's a joint operation between Sussex and Surrey Police, and it's called Operation Signature. And I know of its existence because when I set up the Vulnerable Adults Investigation Team, I looked around the area and identified that this piece of work was being done. And I actually took the author of the scheme to the City of London, and we did a presentation to a senior detective and said, look, this piece of work is a no-brainer for the police. It's very much proactive. It's supporting vulnerable people, and it's something that needs rolling out. And from that actual interaction, we managed to get it rolled out across all forces. So if you Google Operation Signature, you'll see some of the advice that they provide. There's loads of YouTube videos. They can arrange for like call blocker devices to be put in place, money management of the subject, whereby you can have like a carer's card, which allows you to monitor spending. But certainly with the phone calls, you can block those unwanted, unsolicited calls. And of course, you can also apply to have those types of calls blocked through a scheme. Escapes me, but there is a scheme. You can apply, sign a form, and it gets sent through to BT or your service provider. And it screens out those sort of unsolicited, unwarranted calls.
So is it by telephone that most sort of confidence
Yeah.
scams actually happen? Just give us a scenario, because often if you be forewarned is forearmed, isn't it? How do confidence
Yeah.
brokers get the
They
trust
are,
and then
yeah,
get them to do whatever they want? What's going on there?
they are very cunning, and I've been blown away by some of the sort of things that they get up to. But basically, generally, there's a little consortium of fraudsters, and they work together. I'd give you an example, and this again was me as a police officer. We had a gentleman in his late 60s, I think, early 70s, who had lived all his life with his parents. Both parents sadly passed away, and he got left the home and a big chunk of their savings. He receives a call from this fraudster team, and this is how it kicked off, to say, we've noticed you've got some issues with your roof, but don't worry, we can sort that out by satellite nowadays with the technology that's available. And sadly, this chap went to the bank, transferred the money to this fraudster, which then started a chain reaction whereby they discovered how easy he was as a target. So they then went back for more and more. And the next call was from someone who's supposed to be a barrister, or I could get a call from a barrister out of the blue, but basically said, we believe that you've been defrauded. We're getting together a little syndicate, and if you'd like to join our syndicate, if you pay 25,000, we'll try and get your money back. What then happened? He got another phone call to say, the check you sent us, we've lost it because you sent us another one. Of course, the first check had been cleared. So they'd had 50 grand just for this one scam alone. They just went on and on. The people visited his home. They did some work within the loft space. The work they did actually made the place unsafe. But because of how naive this chap was, he certainly didn't suffer from dementia. He may have had a learning disability, but it wasn't evident. But he was just particularly naive. They just saw him as a soft touch and kept going back and back.
Really sad, yeah.
Until the bank woke up and contacted us. And he'd drawn down at that point 180,000. And he got his last 20,000 in his savings. And it was that when the bank woke up. I had a big issue with the bank at the time. I said, look, how on earth have you allowed this to take place? And then we shifted him to try and get some of that money back through the bank because of their sort of failings. But
And
yeah,
did you have much luck with that?
I left the unit before we got a result, but I believe so. I believe so.
I don't think it could have happened 30 or 40 years ago where each bank had its own manager and probably would have
Yeah,
known their clients by name, and bank tellers would have known their clients, and pretty much you would have been looked after really
yeah,
and protected.
yeah.
Let's see now. So obviously the telephone is one way in which scamsters can reach vulnerable people, but confidence tricks generally. But what should people look out for via email? What sort of scams are
Email, I get them on a daily basis, really, and I find them also in my trash bin and by email. It might be from a family member, or they've identified the details of a family member. I'm struggling with money. I'm stuck in wherever, the Far East. I need to get home. Can you wire me some money? I've known of quite a few people actually caught in that one. There's the Nigerian prince or princess one. That's quite a famous one.
are they
These, to me, they seem pretty
upfront?
obvious. Yeah, it seemed pretty obvious. But yeah, the email scams. I did a little presentation for an organization in London, and there was an email address, and it looked like a genuine email address. And the only thing that was different was the A within one of the names, and it was like a Greek A as opposed to the standard A that we would use. And that's the only thing. You know, I had to zoom right in to actually see the difference. So email scams are fairly frequent. The ones with the links. We've received a package at the sorting office. We need your address to add it on. Can you click this link? Of course, how would they know your email address? But people, unfortunately, click the link and then think about it afterwards. If you receive unsolicited emails, never ever click a link, even if it looks pretty genuine. If you look at the sender, you'll generally see that it's a kind of a made up email address. So emails are quite bad. Postal scams are getting less and less. That's perhaps hopefully due to the work done by a lady who's started a campaign called Think Jessica. This started because her mother was scammed out of significant sums of money through postal scams. And she was convinced that if she kept going, that she'd get her money back. She'd been brainwashed, basically. And I'm just trying to think the lady's name, Marilyn. She's got an OPE from the work that she's done. But I think Jessica's a good place to look to get more understanding of these sort of postal scams. But what she did was did some work with the post office and trading standards to identify hotspots where vulnerable individuals were receiving more posts than in their character. And they started monitoring and doing stuff with the post to prevent the scam going through.
Gotcha. So even if you put a call blocker on or a call filter for telephone calls and you're careful with emails and posts, people can still come to the door. Is that of vulnerable people? What about the prevalence of sort of face-to-face scamming or confidence tricks during? Is that something which is still going
There's
on?
less and less of that now because you've instantly exposing yourself. So if you do it by phone or email, you're hidden behind the email address. But if you're doing it face to face, someone's seen your face. So that's become less and less. However, local trading standards are always happy to receive any concerns that people may have about perhaps rogue traders and the like, the people who want to tarmac a driveway and end up putting about a centimetre of tarmac down, those sorts of people. So they are still about, but they are monitored actually by trading standards. The fraudster team with the gentleman who had his roof sorted out by satellite, they were jobbing builders, basically the rogue traders. So that these guys were into everything. But they've changed their tactics from this knocking on the door and kind of tarmac a driveway to this more elaborate scam of satellite imagery and that sort of stuff. It was crazy, really.
I see. If you, and I don't know, Paul, if you have vulnerable relatives or friends and you've done what you felt that you could do regarding calls and emails and posts and stuck a camera on the front door, there are door-to-door scammers, what other measures can you do as a sort of an alert to yourself that someone's being scammed? Should you check their bank statements on a regular basis or what?
Yeah, I was Yeah, I would always advocate the use of kind of some sort of specialist software, a carer's guide, whereby if the individual is spending money, at least you can monitor it and you get a ping if there's a transaction which is out of character. So that's something that I would recommend. And there are a number of types of card out there that are worth a look. Yeah, there's all sorts of good advice out there through the likes of Age UK, Hourglass, which used to be Action on Elder Abuse. There's videos and all sorts of really good stuff to make people aware and to assist with an issue. At one point, so that Hourglass used to be called Action on Elder Abuse. And at one point, I was one of their sort of go-to people for financial abuse matters. If they received a call, which is a little bit more complex, into their call center, then they would divert the call to me to try and give that advice to steer the people into the right direction. More than happy to do that with anybody, really, if they want to drop me a line and if they have concerns. In the last 2 days, I've spoken to 3 different people about issues they've got with aging parents who are declining in health, mental and physical. But I think it happens to us all, really, at some point
I'll
in life.
need to give you contact details again at the end, Paul. But how, if someone was wanting some advice on suspected fraud or actual fraud or whatever, how would they get in touch with you?
By email is the best one. That gets received on my phone. If there is sufficient concern to think that it is a safeguarding issue, then the first point of call should be social care to safeguarding team. And if you're going to send something to the safeguarding team, I'd also suggest that you do the same to the police, to like the safeguarding unit or the multi-agency safeguarding hub, which a lot of forces have nowadays. So that like belt and braces approach. What I would say is if anybody identifies any concern that they have, is don't do nothing. And I say that because there's a really good bit of academic work that was done, which identified what's called the bystander intervention model. So basically, what this looked at is where staff working with vulnerable clients have assumed that someone else has taken action. And as it turns out, nobody took action. So I think it's preferred that a referral is made. And if they receive 2 referrals, well, that's great. That shows that there is a significant concern for the individual. But it's not acceptable really to do nothing. It should go. And if it goes to the safeguarding units, then it's dealt with discreetly. They don't necessarily need to identify the source, but at least they're aware of the situation and can monitor it. And if it needs a visit from a specialised social worker and police officer, maybe, then they would probably be in plain clothes, and it's dealt with very delicately, and that's all part of the training.
Yeah, then I see governments doing to protect vulnerable people in terms of legislation, regulations that can actually have teeth, that actually potentially take fraudsters off the playing field, so to speak, or punish them so severely that they're not going to want to do it. Are they doing it?
I'd like to say they are, and I knew you were going to ask me this question, so I looked at some of the stuff that's up and coming. It's the Online Safety Bill, which should protect vulnerable people from online issues. Financial Services Markets Act, Enhanced Money Laundering Regulations, and the CARE Act 2014. Now, those, to my mind, I don't think they are significant to really assist the situation. And I say this because Action on Elder Abuse a few years ago had a campaign where they wanted to bring in bespoke legislation which made elder abuse, not necessarily just financial abuse, but any elder abuse, as a hate crime. And by making it a hate crime, it polarized the response from the police because they had a new bit of legislation that they had to work to, but it never happened. They never got it off the ground. Now, I've been working with a lady who's resident on the Isle of Man, whose parents had been significantly defrauded, and she set up on a campaign on the island to bring in new legislation, bespoke legislation, and that will make the abuse of anyone over the age of 65 a hate crime. What we really wanted in the UK. Now, what's happened and how this came about, I introduced this lady to a friend and colleague in the States, Now, this chap is an ex-UK lawyer, prosecutor, and he went across the States and he became prosecutor in California. So he sat the bar exam and he ended up being a deputy district attorney in San Diego. And this chap, Paul Greenwood, knowing how all the response and the work, being undertaken in the UK compared to what's going on in the States, particularly in California, he said, look, you need this legislation in the UK. So the Californians drafted a piece of legislation which made anybody over the age of 65 the victim of any crime. The sentencing tariff was that much higher, so it made it a hate crime. But the clever bit of the legislation is that you not only got the penal code, the criminal penal code, but you got like a bolt-on bit of civil legislation. So what that did, if people were prosecuted or attempted to prosecute through the criminal process, but for some reason it failed, then the backup position was through this civil legislation, whereby the criminal court could provide some of the funding towards the civil litigation in order to allow that person to get their money back. I thought, what a fantastic bit of legislation, piece by piece, to bring it out in the Isle of Man. And I'm desperate that if it works and is shown to work on the Isle of Man, that we could do the same in the UK, obviously because there's different legislation. The Isle of Man to the UK. That's down the line, but that's my hope. But at the moment, we've got bits and pieces of legislation, but there's nothing that is really powerful enough to get the justice for these people. I talk of the iceberg theory of financial abuse. It demonstrates that we identify only like a minuscule amount and prosecute an even smaller amount. But really, you've got this massive great amount that falls below it. We need to...
Lots of people coming forward with fraud. Are they just sadly embarrassed, or they've given up hope there'll be any justice done, or what? Why don't people go to the authorities?
The problem is you get so much pushback from the police. And I say that as an ex-police officer, where I've taken really superb cases to the police and they get pushed back as a civil matter. And the reason being is the police just haven't got the means to deal with any fraud really nowadays, let alone fraud affecting the elderly and vulnerable. So that's the biggest hurdle, is the fact that until numbers are reintroduced into the police and training is rolled out and we're up to speed with where we were several years ago before the austerity measures kicked in, then I don't think we've got a chance with any fraud, let alone fraud affecting the elderly, which is a sad state of affairs. But sadly, I don't think it's just the UK. We've got friends in other locations such as Canada, and I think they're suffering the same problem. Police are firefighting. They're only dealing with stuff that comes through the door, dealing with the more violent crime. And unfortunately, fraud kind of sits at the bottom of the rung of the ladder. My argument's always been, if you're talking about fraud affecting the very vulnerable, it's not just fraud, because the emotional and physical impact on that individual who's perhaps lost all their savings to a scammer it could hasten their death. So it's a significant issue in my book. And it's something that the authorities need to sit up and take action about, because it's sadly getting worse instead of better. Which is probably not a good note to finish with, but
you're just being honest, aren't you, really? So the governments are struggling to do anything to reduce it, and the police have limited resources and are channeling their efforts elsewhere. So logically, the message must be that if you want to protect, or if you've got a vulnerable loved one or friend, you should be the one to do whatever you can to avoid fraud happening. Prevention being better than cure. There is no cure at the moment, but so you've got to take steps yourself really before it happens.
Absolutely, yeah. So prevention is obviously better than the cure anyway. But certainly look for the unusual transactions within a bank account, changes to signatories on accounts, that sort of thing. Just anything out of the ordinary, really, which would be an immediate red flag to me, but it might not be so obvious to someone else. When I do my investigations, one of the things that I look at is the pattern of spending. I would generally look to sort of provide a timeline of financial transactions, which is overlaid with perhaps a decline in mental health, and then see what the financial spending tells me compared to what's going on in someone's frailty. So the last case I dealt with was a lady who was a resident in a care home, was bedbound, but she was spending significant sums of money on luxury items. So in my report, I identified that these types of spending, although I can't say for sure, but what I can insinuate is that it's likely not to be in the best interests of the individual. Spending on clothing in sort of modern stores, which a teenager might use, but it's been £300-400 spent at that location, and the person's like in their late 80s, bedbound. So it seemed pretty obvious, but when it's laid out in a report, it makes for powerful reading.
Is there any sort of banks? There's some of these new, quite innovative online banks that are offering different services, say foreign exchange, much cheaper foreign exchange and things like that. Are there any banks which are offering super secure accounts for vulnerable people? Is that something that banks will market their accounts on? It's not something I've seen, but you'd think it would be quite a good product to be offering to clients. Do you
Yeah, I mean,
meet banks that are offering that?
yeah, there are sort of the online banks like Monzo, but everything's done purely online. What I would guard against is I'd rather see someone take out a power of attorney so they can manage someone's finances correctly and there's some oversight than become a signatory on a bank account. Because once you've got that situation, funds often get commingled and it's very difficult to identify what spending is for which individuals. Keeping things separately in an attorney account managed by someone with authority through a lasting power of attorney is a much better place to be than like a general authority, a signatory to a bank account.
No, absolutely. Brilliant. It's been brilliant to chat to you, Paul. Thank you very much for your time. Just so people, if obviously people are interested in your service or advice, how will they get in touch with you? What's your website?
It's simply Paul Smith Consultancy Services .com. My email address is Paul before the web address, really, Paul at paulsmithconsultancy.com.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Lovely to chat, and we'll speak soon.
Great. Thanks very much.
Take care.